All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, Trump is gone, nature is healing, Washington especially is healing. Unfortunately, that means, as usual, you will all suffer more. What I want to focus on today is the tyranny of the bipartisan consensus, how it is specifically engineered to screw average people in America, how it's going to reign supreme in the Joe Biden era, and how it just shows, above all, how titanic of a struggle it is going to be in the coming years for people who think differently to escape this hellish nightmare and actually do something in America. Yesterday, we outlined the new bipartisan working group comprised of neoliberal deficit hawks on both sides of the aisle in the Senate who are uniting in opposition to more money for Americans in the COVID relief bill. What these people focus their ire on is the idea that in some highly limited use cases, a family with six-figure income may receive some government aid. They didn't specify how many families that would be, how much money, how negligible it would actually be to the overall amount that those families are receiving itself. That's all out of the question. It's incredibly dumb for a variety of reasons. Number one is that, of course, this amount of aid would be overwhelmingly targeted at lower income Americans who vastly outnumber the high income households who would receive a check. Second, because they literally cut the taxes of those people making $300,000 a year a number of times in recent years, with the explicit justification that it would lead to more trickle-down economics and more aggregate spending. It seems to have forgotten that lesson. And third, because in the middle of a crisis, doing something that is unifying is more important than doing something which is quote-unquote targeted. Look, I'm not going to change any minds here, so let's focus on why this gambit by the so-called moderates really matters. For once, I actually agree with Brian Buehler, who's over at Crooked Media, who correctly observed that what's really happening here is a fake attempt at pretending 60 votes are gettable for some pared-down version of the bill. Eventually, Republicans and deficit hawks will find some way not to actually vote for that 60-vote solution, but the problem is that by then, the moderate solution is now the 51-vote budget reconciliation maneuver that 51 votes can actually materialize for. That's exactly correct. All of this maneuvering, all of the hand-wringing about how the bill is too big and not targeted enough, it's completely fake. To the extent that it's a strategy, it is a strategy to move the goalposts and more so to delay the eventual budget reconciliation process. Here's the thing, it's already working. Take a look at how Joe Biden answered a question when asked about yesterday at the White House.
Well, I proposed that because it was bipartisan, I thought it would increase the prospects of passage, the additional $1,400 in direct cash payment to folks. Well, there's legitimate reason for people to say, do you have the lines drawn the exact right way? Should it go to anybody making over X number of dollars or why? I'm open to negotiate those things.
So now he's negotiating. He says it'll take a few weeks. Yeah, let me save you all the trouble and tell you that's not going to happen. And when they eventually do go to reconciliation, which I think we owe it to all of you to tell you exactly how that's going to be, it ain't going to be a cakewalk. Jake Sherman over at Punchbowl News had an excellent roundup yesterday of what exactly this process is going to look like. As usual, involving anything with the U.S. Senate, it's a total nightmare. To actually pass a COVID relief bill through budget reconciliation by the time unemployment benefits expire in mid-March, Democrats would have to get started like yesterday. But they're not. Moreover, once that process is started, you are basically allowed to try and amend the bill as many times as you want. Last time, we saw something similar. There were literally 700 amendments that had to be considered. It took weeks. This time, they say it could expect even more than that. The Biden strategy right now is to keep everything bundled, the popular along with the partisan, and hope that the popular can bolster the partisan while negotiating some key parts down. But here's the problem. You have enough Senate Republicans who are willing to literally eat shit for their false ideology and stand in the way of the popular and the partisan. And I really wanted Joe Biden to be successful. He is our president, after all. I noted here so many times about how easy it would be for him to be the most popular president of our lifetimes. But what is he doing? As far as I can tell, nothing. He's wasted the first week of his presidency without a single piece of legislation on the floor of the U.S. Senate. As you've heard me say here, he likes to think of himself as FDR. So much so, he put a portrait of the man in the center of the Oval. And guess what? FDR already had passed one of the most consequential pieces of legislation of his entire presidency by this time as president. The first of the 15 bills in the first 100 days. Biden had, and he still has the opportunity. The way to actually create real bipartisanship for good things is to lean into things which are so dramatically popular and unbundle them from any potential excuses to actually put people on the spot, force them to go along. Why is there right now, as we speak, not $2,000 check legislation on the floor of the U.S. Senate? More than 7 Republicans are already on the record saying that they would support such a measure. Why not take the easiest layup in history? Sign the legislation in the Oval Office with Republican senators right next to you. That when the next negotiation comes up for a vote, you can actually negotiate having done something. It's so simple. Biden has the bully pulpit. He has a 70% approval rating. He could actually use the force of his popularity for good and impact people's lives. Instead, the White House cannot even get to commit to anything done by March.
Well, there's an urgency to moving it forward, and he certainly believes it needs to be there needs to be progress in the next couple of weeks.
So he thinks by March it could get passed?
Well, I don't want to give it a deadline on it, Caitlin, but I think we are all mindful and looking at that timeline in March as to when we will hit the unemployment cliff, and it's vital to get things done quickly and rapidly, as quickly as possible.
Yeah, who would want to put a deadline on important relief, right? They're going to bundle it. They won't reveal who they're speaking to. If they get this done, mark my words, right here, it will look much more like the so-called moderate proposal that was put forward by Susan Collins and Joe Manchin and Angus King. It will be 2 months late. It will be riddled with problems. And ultimately, the people who will suffer the consequences will be those working Americans or business owners or the myriad others for whom this relief would have made a massive impact upon their lives. That is the tragedy of this entire scheme, and increasingly, it is becoming reality. And Crystal, I actually just saw something come across my screen from Jeff Stein, a new study which is out of a university, and it actually shows that poverty substantively increased in that 6-month period where they allowed unemployment benefits to expire. They're probably going to do the exact same thing here. What is Biden doing? He's saying he's going to negotiate. They're going to try and negotiate the price down. I think we both know that that's not actually going to happen, and that at the end of the day, it will still have to move to reconciliation. And at the end of the day, if you really want it to pass, then you need to start like yesterday or the day before. You should have had legislation written. The entire way that he's thinking about his presidency is like Senate first, presidency next, as if he's some sort of side actor. Dude, you're the president. You can force the Senate. You could literally, you are the leader of the Democratic Party and the nation. You could say, we're going to pass this at this and set the benchmark. Put pressure on Joe Manchin, but he's not doing any of that.
Yeah.
He's still acting like he's a senator.
That's actually really interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I mean, he was a senator for a bajillion years.
Yeah.
He's still
he's acting that way.
Like he still has that loyalty to that and deference to that institution, rather than recognizing the muscle he has to flex. But I also think it comes down to and I'm going to talk a little bit about this in my radar too. What do you mean by restore the soul of the nation? Now, in some ways, it was a really good tagline because it's one of those that people could it doesn't mean anything, and people could kind of project onto it whatever they wanted, right? So if you were one of these affluent suburban moderates who just cares about people being civil, then that's what you heard in it.
Yes.
And if you were someone who actually was like, oh my God, I'm struggling, we need some real healing. I need some healing in my own family, in my community, to be able to get through this period, you may have heard okay, we're going to take some concrete steps here. And Biden himself has at different times signaled both directions. So the most consistent messaging has been the sort of vague platitudes messaging, and that's certainly what was foremost in his speech at the inauguration and in launching. I don't want to downplay this, but even in launching, just talking about Charlottesville, and he had that direction of restore the soul of the nation, which is much more about how he believes the words of a president matter, which they do, but they're not the only thing that matter. So he's kind of conflicted between these two, the FDR portrait and the actually doing stuff, and his multi-decade history of basically only caring about the civility, unity politics. So when it comes down to it, that's where he's always going to go. That's where he's always going to go. It makes him very easy to manipulate. And what you're going to see play out time and time again is he's going to propose something that's actually decent, It's like pretty good, pretty laudable, would make a real difference for people. And then instantly allow I'm not going to call them, they're really extremists because they're wildly out of step with the American people, to
just because they have power in the Senate doesn't mean that
they're
speak
moderate,
for everyone.
right? Or that they speak for, no, these are extremists in terms of their views vis-a-vis the American people. He allows them to hostage take, he allows them to negotiate him down, he's completely open to it. And by the time you get anything done, it's so watered down, and people are so cynical because they feel like they've been lied to, that you end up in a really ugly place.
On the off chance anybody in the White House ever watches this, look, I'm not going to hold my breath, but you never know. I get some weird messages sometimes. Look, how do you think FDR actually passed the New Deal? There were 20 or 30 senators in his own coalition of Democrats who, by today's standards, would be deficit hawk Republicans, right? They just happened to be from the South and were like segregationists, so it's a different story. Now, they all hated the New Deal, and they hated FDR. Every single one of them voted for one of those FDR New Deal programs in the first 100 days. Why? Because they were terrified that they would lose their seats. They were terrified that if they were to stand up against FDR, that they would lose in their own home states. For the first time, they actually saw someone who could defeat them with the sheer amount of popularity because he mobilized people to come out and vote because he said, I'm going to change your life. Imagine how different history would be if FDR came in with a similar mandate and then turned around to like Russell from Georgia and was like, hey, you write the New Deal legislation.
Right.
We'd be screwed.
Right.
There'd be
How would
nothing.
that go?
Okay? How would that be? Instead, he leveraged his public position and love with the people to force these senators in order to vote with him. I mean, this doesn't take a genius.
Well,
read 2 books on the history of the New Deal.
It's such a
right
good point because the way that they think about, so I think Manchin is up pretty soon for re-election. The way they think about people who are vulnerable in their states is like, oh, we can't put them in a tough position. We can't make them take
Put them in a tough position. Yeah.
You need to be thinking of like, oh, they're in a tough position. That means we have leverage.
Yes.
That means that they have to face the voters really soon. And if they go against something that's popular, we're going to put them in a tough place to make them support the agenda of the people. So it's the exact reverse of the way that they actually think about it. But that assumes that Biden really is like committed to an agenda that he's laid out. And I just don't think that that's the case. I mean, he may like the iconography of FDR. He may like imagining himself in that vein. But when it comes down to it, his actual politics aren't anything remotely approaching that. So he can hang the portrait in the Oval Office. But what he actually is committed to is this sort of like incrementalist, find the center of where the elites are, not with their American people, where the elites are, and negotiate and bargain from there.
No,
that's what we're seeing.
It's FDR LARPing. Anyway, looking forward to your radar next, Crystal.